Welcome to Insight in Person from the Kellogg School of Management. I'm your host, Jessica Love. Many people think about risk management as a defensive strategy, a tool for minimizing exposure to economic crises or public relations blowouts. But Russell Walker, a clinical associate professor of managerial economics and decision sciences at the Kellogg School of Management, argues that businesses should be thinking about risk management very differently. He's just written a book on the topic, Winning with Risk Management, which he'll be discussing with us today. Welcome, Russell.
Thank you.
Your book argues that a company's risk management strategy can actually bring it a competitive advantage. Can you start by explaining just what you mean?
The world of business has taught us that companies develop competencies and use those to create advantages. Companies might, for instance, be excellent in operations, in marketing, pricing, branding, what have you. Risk management indeed is a corporate competency, ability for a company to understand hazards that it's facing in the marketplace, but also to better understand how its organization interprets that information and uses that information to build a new strategy.
And you actually stress the importance of researching how your levels of risk-taking and preparedness stack up to your competitors.
Indeed. So in the same way we would ask ourselves to do a benchmarking, how do we compare against another firm on pricing, or how do we compare against a firm on branding, we could ask the same questions about risk management. How does the organization tie into knowledge networks? How is the organization exposed to global stresses, global shocks, shocks in supply chains, or even risk from regulation?
You point out that operational risk in particular is often mismanaged to a company's peril. What do you mean by operational risk, and why is it important to manage well?
Largely operational risk are the negative outcomes, or include the negative outcomes associated with executing a strategy. And it's often the case that we remember, or at least are reminded of the very catastrophic, image-driven events, external events, explosions, hazards, tornadoes, what have you. But many organizations fail not because of outside stresses, but because of challenges internally. They may be technological challenges, and in fact may be organizational issues dealing with information, dealing with disconfirming information that might suggest that risks are different. And so operational risk mostly is the implicit risk that an organization has accepted by setting a strategy.
So let's move to a couple concrete examples. Your book takes us through the way two different cell phone companies, Nokia and Ericsson, both responded to the same crisis, a fire in a supplier's factory that delayed production of a critical component. But the two companies' responses to this crisis were night and day. What happened?
Great question, and the case is a famous one because it highlights how two companies were exposed essentially the same identical risk, right? Both of them are using a single supplier. This single supplier, Philips in the case, makes a memory chip that is unique in the cell phone industry. Both Nokia and Ericsson find themselves dependent on this single supplier. When the single supplier is unable to produce chips because of a fire event at their factory, Nokia and Ericsson take drastically different approaches. Ericsson, the sort of laissez-faire, will wait for more information on our supplier. Nokia more proactively seeks out more information and attempts to discover and understand the international supply of these memory chips, which at the time were very critical. And as you might guess, that more proactive approach by Nokia allowed them to secure the international supply of this memory chip, and perhaps most boldly, Nokia purchased the entire international supply of the chips, preventing Ericsson from acquiring any supply, which is an excellent example of where Nokia was able to provide their competitor Ericsson a death blow, and in doing so gain market share. They picked up 3% of the world's market share from Ericsson and paid Ericsson nothing for that. The case also is very important in today's world of technology, where many companies, namely Apple, are very contingent upon suppliers operating in Asia that deliver iPhones and iPads, and there are critical components in all of those. It has changed, that experience has changed how technology companies in particular view their global supply chain and in fact assess the risk of their suppliers.
How so?
We have found that many of the components used into technological devices, iPhones, iPads, now accept one of many different components in the marketplace. Yeah, so whereas in the case of Nokia and Ericsson, the phones were designed around one particular memory chip, only one, made by one supplier. Now many of the devices have built in an engineering flexibility, if you would, that allows them to receive one of many different components. It provides the company flexibility, but also preserves a lot of their cost benefits associated with leveraging single suppliers. We've also seen that Apple's a great example, has changed its relationship with suppliers, where it has a nearly exclusive relationship with Foxconn and develops, very deep relationships with its partners. This case shows that both Ericsson and Nokia lack that kind of deep relationship with the supplier.
Would you say there are any other ways that technology has shaped the risk landscape?
Many ways. The book showcases an example of the credit card industry in the context of a fraud scheme at TJ Maxx. So TJ Maxx, of course, is a large retailer here in the U.S. And as a company, they're not one that you would expect necessarily be competitive in the world of data security. But because they elected not to take particular actions to upgrade the security on their credit card transaction systems, they became the victim of a very sophisticated and targeted fraud scheme in which individuals stole credit card information from the satellite transfers from TJ Maxx stores to their headquarters. That showcases how companies have now become exposed to technological risk when they never expected to be exposed to those. TJ Maxx is a retailer. They compete on selling brands and clothes and all the things that we wish to wear, not on credit card security and the technology necessary for that. But now all companies are exposed to that, even companies that run small e-commerce web pages, what have you. So it highlights, and it was the largest example of credit card fraud to date in the U.S., the need for companies to stay abreast of technological risk.
And time and again, your book frames risk as this opportunity, and I know you've touched on it briefly before. Why do you think that the more positive aspects of risk being opportunity instead of just this fear of negative things happening, why are these positive aspects ignored?
They're largely ignored because risk has been presented in the world of downside, right? Not necessarily as upside. What is fascinating about risk and understanding your competitive position against risk is that if your competitor is to falter, if you could assist your competitor in some demise, their assets, be them market share, factories, brands, what have you, get transferred. And in the context of risk, if we look at the examples that the book shows of Nokia and Ericsson and a few others, even Toyota and British Petroleum, we see that assets, largely market assets and market share, get transferred for nothing. And what's really exciting about competing on risk is that you could, quote, buy your competitor's assets for free. Acquire them at a discount. And that largely will define the winners and the losers in a marketplace.
You said something really interesting in your book about CEO tenure and how that might actually influence how companies think about risk. I thought that was a really interesting point. Do you mind sharing?
Yes, it's interesting because if we look at CEO tenure in the Fortune 500, the exact numbers are in the book, but I believe typical CEO tenure is 4 to 7 years. It's not uncommon for it to even be less. It suggests that a CEO, given his or her reward package, compensation package, may take risk or investments that maximize short-term results, that are results within that 4 to 7 year tenure, and potentially expose the firm to larger risk later down the road. Now, this was in many ways seen during the financial crisis of 2008, many accusations made that executives, banking leaders, indeed did take larger risk in the short term, exposing the firms to risk later down the road. And we've even heard calls from Congress to say that CEO compensation should be delayed, it should be vested over a longer period of time. In many ways, if we look at how a CEO performs in that regard, we could look at family businesses as a comparison, where a family business has often the goal of preserving the company over a very long period of time. In fact, even transferring it to its next generation. And we find that they take different risk selections. In fact, those risks are more in the direction of how do I preserve this and grow this in a sustainable way versus how do I grow revenue rapidly, quickly.
So it might not be a bad thing for us all to start thinking about public corporations more as family corporations.
Well, if you think about it in the fact that you own it and it's yours, you think about it very differently. In fact, one of the suggestions is that CEOs should be compensated entirely by stock, entirely by ownership. In fact, every employee is more vested in the company than they realize. Their salary comes from the organization. So they may not have stock formally or may not have a large percentage, but they're directly impacted by any of its success or lack of success.
So where should a manager interested in better risk management start?
The most important thing that I believe a manager should do tactically is to develop a rich set of what I call knowledge networks. Networks that bring information about the underlying understanding of the market, the underlying understanding of competitors, and underlying understanding of their internal operations to his or her department. And focus on that information in particular that questions or disconfirms the prevailing understanding.
Well, thank you so much for speaking with us today.
Thank you.
That was Russell Walker, a clinical associate professor of managerial economics and decision sciences at the Kellogg School. His book, Winning with Risk Management, is now available with World Scientific Press. For more of the latest faculty research, visit Kellogg Insight at insight.kellogg.northwestern.edu.